Path of Exile's 3.27 update has launched over the weekend, and one of the top features of the new Keepers of the Flame League is the addition of a bunch of new Foulborn Unique items, which are uniques that have had one or several modifiers replaced with new modifiers. Now, we're not sure just yet which parts of this new updated version of the Breach mechanic are going to go into the core game at the end of the league, but the new Foulborn Uniques are enabling a ton of new builds in this patch. There are modifier combinations that either haven't been possible before, or they were possible at some point in the past but were nerfed. And that means that there may be some builds that are only playable in this league if the Foulborn items aren't going to return in the future. So with that said, I plan to cover a lot of the interesting ones in several videos, beginning with this one. So let's get straight into it. And we're beginning with some damage taken as defensive setups, because in this patch we're actually gaining access to even more of this stat, and you will remember that back in 3.25, GGG actually nerfed this stat quite heavily to prevent people from reaching very high amounts of it, and prior to that patch, the meta defensively was to stack a bunch of this up to 100% or close to 100%, and that was basically nerfed big time with a lot of removal of the stat across the board. Some unique items still existed, and you have things like Lightning Coil, which is still very strong. And in this patch, we have Zoph's Heart and the Halcyon, both of which have 15%, or I should say up to 15% physical damage from hits taken as. For Zoph's Heart, it's taken as fire, and for the Halcyon, it's taken as cold. Now, this introduction is an amulet, which means that it's now possible to reach 100% again. So to do that, you're going to combine a 15% amulet with a Lightning Coil for 50% of physical hit damage taken as lightning damage, and then a Dawnbreaker for 20% of physical damage taken as fire damage, and then you can get the Eldritch Helm modifier there, which is an Ether modifier, for 6% or more damage taken as elemental. That's for hits specifically, and the last bit of percentage there is going to come from a Bound by Destiny Jewel, which can roll between 5 to 10%. That is on a 4 influence mod item, so you're going to need to equip 4 influence of a specific type. It could be Warlord for fire, for example, and that will round you out at 100% physical hit damage taken as elemental. And remember that you don't really want to go over 100% because then you actually take more damage than the initial hit. But reaching 100% physical damage from hits taken as elemental is exceptionally strong defensively, and it's very strong in combination with a few particular mechanics. The first is obviously Transcendence, which is a keystone that applies your armor to elemental hit damage taken instead of physical damage, and that keystone has these two massive downsides. The first is, of course, that your armor no longer prevents physical damage from hits, and the other is the minus 15% to maximum elemental resistances, which is a massive, massive downside. And by stacking up 100% physical damage from hits taken as elemental, you're able to first mitigate that downside with armor no longer preventing damage from incoming physical hits, but then you need to actually deal with the other downside. So once you actually have that armor applying to elemental, obviously that's going to provide you incredible mitigation for incoming physical or elemental hit damage there, because it's going to apply to both of those as you're already taking all of the physical hit damage as elemental. But what about that minus 15% max res? That is really bad for incoming damage over time specifically. And that's where another good combination comes in, which is the Chieftain Ascendancy. Now, Chieftain has access to the Valaco Notable to apply maximum fire resistance modifiers to cold and lightning as well. And you're able to pretty trivially get to 90% on that Ascendancy. So if you have minus 15%, you should be able to get somewhere towards that more baseline level of 75 or 80% fairly easily by combining some different mechanics together. Things like Purity of Fire with a little bit of aura effect scaling, and maximum resistance from jewels, and Eldritch modifiers, and the passive tree. That will get you up to a decent amount of resistance once again, and then you'll have a really strong defensive setup where you're able to deal with incoming hits and tank them like crazy, right? Because you'll be reducing that damage by maybe 80% initially from your resistances, and then the armor is potentially going to provide up to 90% mitigation there. It depends on how small that hit is after the resistance has been applied. And then for damage over time, you should be okay too at around 80 or 75% resistance. Now, speaking of Transcendence, let's move on to another Foulborn Unique item, which is the Foulborn version of Brass Dome, which replaces the maximum resistance modifier with Transcendence. Now, this is the first and only time ever that you can acquire Transcendence outside of a Timeless Jewel, which means that this will be the first time that you'll be able to combine Transcendence with other Timeless Jewel exclusive keystones, the most notable of which is likely Strength of Blood. Now, Strength of Blood is a keystone which is really good if you use it correctly and really terrible if you don't use it correctly. This is a keystone that essentially transforms your life recovery from leech, and that is leech over time, not instant leech. It transforms it into additional physical damage reduction. So whilst you would actually normally be leeching your life, you are instead provided additional physical damage reduction at a rate of 2% per 3% of life leech. So this is a way to be able to get a lot of additional physical damage reduction, which is another way to solve Transcendence. So if you're not able to reach, 100% or close to 100% of physical hit damage taken as elemental, you can instead stack true physical damage reduction, which is also known as additional physical damage reduction. And Strength of Blood is a way to gain a lot of that stat. And to actually utilize that keystone correctly, you're going to want to find a way of overleech and also long duration leech. Slayer becomes really good here because Slayer has both of those things. And you can do this in other ways. You can use things like Petrified Blood, or there's other ways to get overleech like the Cortex gloves, for example. But the best way is likely to be Slayer because Slayer gets overleech and it also gets long duration leech. And one of the things you really want with Strength of Blood is a way to continuously, reliably have life leech so that this additional physical damage reduction is a reliable defensive method. With some of the other ways, it just isn't that reliable. So once you have that set up, you can then look into gaining, other ways of additional physical damage reduction. Once again, Slayer comes to mind there because you're able to get an additional endurance charge and you can stack endurance charges. And that's going to be a very strong combination there. Now, one of the other things that you can do with the new Brass Dome Transcendence modifier is combine that with Tempered by War, another Timeless Jewel exclusive keystone. And Tempered by War makes you take 50% of lightning and cold damage as fire damage. And one of the crazy things about armor is that when it's applied to different damage types in a single hit, it's actually applied separately to each damage type, which means that Tempered by War is exceptional for splitting up incoming damage types. For example, you take a very large hit of lightning damage. Let's say you in the Uber Eater and you take the beam right to the face, and that lightning damage is going to be split. Half is taken as lightning damage, half is taken as fire. And what happens is your Transcendence armor is then applied in full to each damage type. So you reduce those damage types by resistance, and then each damage type is applied separately with the armor reduction calculation. And because armor is more effective against incoming smaller hits, it will provide much more mitigation against those resulting smaller hits when the damage is being split up. So that's another really strong combination you could utilize there. But of course, if you're using Brass Dome to gain Transcendence, and if you're using Tempered by War from your Timeless Keystone, you then must solve incoming physical damage in another way, which is likely to be additional physical damage reduction stacking, but you cannot make use of Strength of Blood in that case. Now let's move on to another Foulborn Unique item, and it's the Perfect Form. Now, the Perfect Form has always been quite an interesting unique body armor. It's got a lot worse in recent patches because of the addition of those higher tier base types that provide a lot more defensive capabilities. But the Perfect Form has always been a body armor that's just been difficult to use. That's because whilst it may provide a huge amount of chance to suppress spell damage, 50% is no joke, it also provides acrobatics, and the acrobatics keystone is not really something that you want to use on the majority of builds. This basically stops your suppression from working and instead applies modifiers that grant chance to suppress spell damage to provide spell dodge instead. This is now the only place that you can gain spell dodge in the game. It's kind of a remnant of past Path of Exile that existed a long time ago, and it no longer really exists outside of this keystone. And spell dodge is quite powerful. When you dodge a spell, you don't take any damage from that spell. But spell suppression is just the more preferred defensive method because it's consistent across the board. You always take that 40% or more less damage from those incoming spells. And so this has been a keystone that is not very favourable, and that means that the Perfect Form as a body armor is not really very favourable either. But the Foulborn version of this item replaces acrobatics with Ghost Dance, a much more preferable keystone that enables you to kind of recover energy shield based on incoming hits, based on a percentage of your evasion. which means that now, if you're in a pinch to be able to get a lot of chance to suppress spell damage, you can actually make use of this body armor. It provides a decent amount of evasion, not really too much compared to what modern evasion body armors can reach. But then it also has the modifier evasion rating is increased by overcapped cold resistance, which means there's an angle there to be able to get a lot more evasion than you would be able to on a normal body armor, because you have that modifier to be able to rely on and stack up cold resistance and get a lot more of that stat. But regardless, that's an interesting one if you need a way to get a lot of spell suppression chance because you're using a bunch of other gear that can't get it, or maybe you can't reach different places on the passive tree to be able to take some of those high spell suppression chance wheels, and that is a way to gain a lot of that stat. Now next up on the Foulborn Unique list for this video is Ghost Wraith with the modifier maximum energy shield is equal to 50% of maximum life. Now, this is a really interesting modifier specifically with life stacking Inquisitor in mind. So I made a life stacking Inquisitor a while back, I want to say it was 3 or 4 leagues ago perhaps, and I was able to get that character up to 18 or 19,000 life in the end, and I also had 6,000 energy shield I think on top of that, and you just have an incredible amount of recovery of course for both resources because you're an Inquisitor. And the thing is with that kind of build is that you kind of set that up with the idea that you have a huge amount of life and you're focused on stacking life, and you gain all of your energy shield through stats that grant you a percentage of maximum life as extra energy shield, which works and is very good, but it's also quite a high investment to actually get those stats in the first place. For example, you often use your Timeless Jewel to actually get Corrupted Soul to get a big chunk of that. You'll also use your Anoint or perhaps your Path over to that Melding Notable on the tree there to get a bit more of that stat. And that's kind of the main way that you actually get your energy shield in those builds. Now the idea that you would be able to go full life stack and ignore those modifiers because you have this on your body armor is quite an interesting concept. If you're able to reach, let's say you can get 20 or maybe even 21 or 22,000 life, if you didn't invest into those things that I just discussed there and invested more into life, then you would be able to get, 10, 11,000 energy shield, which is absolutely ridiculous because this actually fixes your energy shield at half of your life. And there are always trade-offs there, of course. One is that you're using your body armor for this. 2 is that you actually usually want to use Corrupted Soul in that type of build because it actually splits the damage in half. You take, half of the incoming hit on your life and half on energy shield. But that is an interesting option nevertheless, and that's definitely something that could be looked into this league. There is a ton of stuff for life stacking this league, different versions of Wrathbith Globe. There's the new axe that came into the game. I'll likely cover those things in another video. Next up is Noedre's Scorn, which is a helmet which has the modifier Socketed Gems are supported by level 30 Impending Doom. Now, Pack actually made a video on this about leveling with this item because it's exceptionally good for leveling. You actually gain access to it, I think, around level 39 perhaps. And then you can also use Vixens as early as level 36, so you can actually do that leveling setup right in the middle of the campaign there. And one of the things about this item that is so powerful is just how much damage level 30 Impending Doom is. So if you take a look here, level 30 Impending Doom is about 6,000 to 9,000 base chaos damage on each of those hits from Impending Doom. So how Impending Doom works is you're able to actually get a lot of overlaps, and that is a ton of potential damage there in the late game if you can set this up correctly. And I will link Pack's video in the description below that he made about this exact interaction here, but that is an incredibly strong helmet that you can utilize there for leveling and perhaps beyond if you want to make a whole build around it. That is plenty of damage to do so. Next up in the list is the Embalmer, which has the modifier on killing a poisoned enemy, nearby enemies are poisoned. Now that is a rare modifier. It's usually only accessible through the Beano's Kitchen Knife, for example, or the Pathfinder's Master Toxicist. And the fact that this is on a pair of gloves means that you can kind of enable poison builds, or specific poison builds I should say, with this. And the reason why I say specific poison builds is because of how this modifier actually works. So this is technically not poison proliferation, even though it's often referred to like that. This works by essentially copying the strongest poison on a dying enemy and then, copying that over to nearby monsters that are alive. And that is going to deal all of the damage that that poison was dealing, so all of your damage modifiers have already been applied to it, so they won't apply a second time. But the base duration is kind of reset to 2 seconds there, and it's then affected by global poison duration modifiers once again. And that's the reason why this is good for specific builds. A generic poison build that likes to stack a lot of stacks of poison and is focusing on, poison duration and hitting as many times as possible is not going to benefit much from this modifier. But something like Viper Strike of the Mamba, which instead deals one very large poison, which deals a huge amount of damage and is only focused on that one poison, well, that's going to be great here because you will always proliferate, or I should say copy, that one strong poison onto nearby monsters. So that is an exceptionally good modifier there, and a bonus there is that the Embalmer can get a second Foulborn modifier, which makes your poisons deal damage faster, so getting a pair of those gloves with both of those modifiers is strong. And one of the last things we'll discuss in this video is Mokou's Embrace, which has a Foulborn version for +3 maximum fire resistance. Now the interesting thing there is that this replaces the cold resistance modifier on that ring. And the cold resistance is a modifier that Chieftain just doesn't care about, because Chieftain wants to stack up fire resistance and is able to deal with lightning and cold in that way. You don't have to interact with cold resistance at all. And this ring is exceptionally good for Chieftain. So +3 maximum fire resistance, and then it's a self-ignite ring. The idea is that you're able to keep an ignite on yourself and you're able to gain these huge bonuses for it, increased attack speed, increased cast speed. And a Chieftain has unaffected by ignite on the Tessadio node there, which means that you're able to inflict an ignite on yourself and benefit from all of these bonuses without taking any extra damage from it. If you're able to use 2 of these, and let's say you're playing an attack build, you might be able to get 80% attack speed or more if you're using catalysts as well, and then 6% to maximum elemental resistances because you're also using Valaco to provide those maximum resistances over to your cold and lightning as well. And you could get even more out of this ring if you're using Wilma's Requital, which is a helmet that then applies those cast speed modifiers to attack speed, but only for totem builds. So that is an interesting interaction you could look into there. Now, there's plenty of other new different techs that you can do with these crazy Foulborn Unique items. There are so many of them that there's just loads of stuff that will go flying under the radar for a long time. But I don't want these videos to end up being too long, so I'll cover more of them in another video soon, and likely another one after that as well. But thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.